Across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean lies one of the darkest chapters in human history, a journey so harrowing that its echoes still reach us today. It is known as the Middle Passage, the transatlantic route that carried millions of enslaved Africans from their homeland to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. But this was not just a journey across water. It was a journey through unimaginable suffering, loss, and survival. Imagine standing on the coast of West Africa centuries ago. The air is heavy with salt and fear. Families are torn apart. Women and children are forced toward the ships, massive wooden vessels built not for comfort, but for profit. The sound of chains clinking and waves crashing drowns out the cries of those who realize they may never see their homeland again. These were not mere travelers, they were human beings stripped of freedom, identity, and hope. As the ships departed the African coast, they carried more than cargo. They carried the stolen lives of millions confined in suffocating darkness below deck. The Middle Passage became a floating prison, a brutal system that connected continents and fueled empires. Yet, behind the statistics and historical records, there are countless untold stories of courage, of resistance, and of the will to survive when every breath was a fight. Today, historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forced onto those ships. Some never made it to shore. Others endured months of torment only to face new forms of hardship upon arrival. But even in that ocean of despair, there were sparks of defiance, whispers of songs, silent prayers, and brave acts of rebellion that refused to let the human spirit die. This story is not only about history, it is about humanity. It reminds us how far people will go both in cruelty and in courage. It forces us to confront questions that still matter today. How did this happen? Who profited from it? And what lessons must we carry forward so that such darkness is never repeated? In this video, we will uncover the real story of the Middle Passage, not just through dates and facts, but through the voices of those who lived it, the ships that sailed it, and the legacy it left behind. If you believe history should be remembered, not forgotten, if you value truth and compassion, then join us on this journey. Like, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the stories that shaped our world. Together, we will explore the past, not to dwell on pain, but to understand resilience, the power that endured even in the heart of the storm. The story of the Middle Passage does not begin on the ocean, but deep within the heart of Africa, in villages surrounded by rivers, forests, and bustling marketplaces that once thrived with life. Before the arrival of foreign ships, these regions were home to complex kingdoms, trade networks, and vibrant cultures bound by traditions and kinship. Yet, as European powers expanded their reach, a shadow fell across these lands, reshaping the destiny of millions. What began as coastal trade soon grew into something far more devastating. European merchants, arriving with weapons, fine textiles, and barrels of alcohol, established relationships with local rulers and middlemen. At first, some saw it as ordinary trade, a way to acquire goods that symbolized wealth and power. But the demand from across the Atlantic grew insatiable. Human lives became the most valuable cargo. The exchange of people for goods transformed the fabric of African society, setting off a chain reaction of fear and destruction. Wars erupted between neighboring kingdoms, not for land or faith, but for bodies, the young, the strong, the able. Raids swept through peaceful villages in the dead of night. Families awoke to fire and shouting, to confusion and terror. Those who were captured were marched for days, sometimes weeks, their wrists bound, their necks chained together. The journey to the coast was its own kind of torment. Many never survived to see the sea. Along the way, the air grew thick with sorrow as captives were forced to leave behind their identity, their language, and everything that once defined them. At the coastal forts, places like Elmina and Cape Coast Castle, the system became horrifyingly efficient. Massive stone structures, built by Europeans, loomed over the shoreline like silent witnesses. Behind their walls were holding cells crowded with hundreds of men and women waiting for the next ship. The air was stifling, the ground damp and cold, the only light coming through narrow slits in the wall. Here, the captives waited in uncertainty, listening to the echo of footsteps above, the creaking of doors, and the crashing waves that would soon carry them away. To the traders, this was business, a global enterprise connecting continents. Ships that arrived full of manufactured goods would leave filled with people, crossing the Atlantic toward the plantations of the New World. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton would then return to Europe, feeding the industries of empire and wealth. Every link in this chain depended on human suffering. But in the ledgers of merchants, the enslaved were reduced to numbers, a form of profit, a commodity. Still, within this machinery of greed, the human spirit persisted. Mothers whispered to their children, promising they would see home again. Elders tried to preserve fragments of their culture through stories and songs, even as their captors sought to erase every trace of it. There were moments of quiet resistance, a refusal to eat, a prayer spoken under breath, a glance exchanged between strangers that said, "We are still live." As the ships prepared to sail, the reality of what awaited became painfully clear. The enslaved were branded, counted, and forced aboard through the infamous door of no return, a stone passage leading directly to the sea. Many stumbled as they descended toward the boats, the salty air mingling with the smell of sweat and fear. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others looked back one last time toward the land that had raised them. That final glimpse of the African coast was, for many, the last memory of home they would ever carry. The European traders justified their actions with ideas of civilization and commerce. But beneath those words lay a truth too cruel to disguise. Entire communities were destroyed for profit. The weapons and goods they exchanged only fueled more violence inland, feeding the cycle that kept the ships full and the markets thriving. What was once a land of proud kingdoms became a place of fear and betrayal, where trust could no longer survive. For the enslaved, the journey from freedom to captivity was a descent into the unknown. The landscapes they passed, rivers, forests, open plains, became silent witnesses to their suffering. And yet, even as chains clanked and guards shouted, fragments of humanity endured. A song hummed softly at night, a hand reaching out to comfort another, the faint rhythm of hope beating beneath despair. By the time they reached the ocean, thousands had already been lost to exhaustion, disease, or heartbreak. Those who remained were herded onto ships waiting in the surf, the wooden decks slick and crowded. The Atlantic stretched before them, endless and merciless. Behind them, the continent that had given them life faded into mist. Ahead lay an uncertain horizon. This was how the Middle Passage began, not as a voyage of adventure or discovery, but as a forced migration built on the suffering of millions. The people taken from Africa were not faceless victims. They were farmers, artisans, warriors, and parents, each carrying memories of laughter, love, and belonging. Their capture marked the beginning of a tragedy that would shape the modern world, weaving pain into the roots of global history. And yet, amid this horror, their endurance became an unspoken testament to human strength. The story of the Middle Passage is not just a record of cruelty, it is also a story of resilience. For even as the world around them sought to turn people into property, their courage ensured that something far greater survived: the will to live, to remember, and to reclaim the humanity that the ocean itself could not wash away. When the enslaved Africans were finally herded onto the ships, the reality of their captivity became terrifyingly clear. For the vessels that had promised passage were nothing more than floating prisons, constructed solely to maximize profit while minimizing concern for human life. From the moment they stepped onto the creaking wooden decks, the air was thick with the mingled odors of sweat, fear, salt, and unwashed bodies, a scent that would cling to every corner of the ship for the duration of the voyage. Below deck, where the captives were forced to remain for weeks or even months at a time, the darkness was nearly absolute, pierced only by narrow slits that allowed a faint trickle of light and the occasional hint of sea air, but never enough to relieve the oppressive heat or the sense of suffocation that enveloped them. Chained together in rows, women and children had almost no room to move, their bodies pressed so tightly against one another that even a shift in position became a struggle. The wooden planks beneath them were rough and damp, soaked by the constant motion of the waves and the inability to maintain any cleanliness in such overcrowded conditions. Disease spread quickly, invisible yet deadly, carried in the sweat and contact of those forced into close confinement, and with little access to water or food of any quality. Exhaustion and dehydration became constant companions. Some lost their lives simply from the inability of their bodies to withstand the relentless pressure. The heat and the stench, while others succumbed to infections and sicknesses that would have been treatable under ordinary circumstances, but were fatal when left to fester among so many tightly packed souls. The human suffering was compounded by the psychological weight of the journey. For men, women, and children alike, the chains were not only physical restraints but constant reminders that they had been torn from their homes, from families, from the land that had nurtured them. The cries of children echoed through the hold, unanswered and often ignored, mingling with the low groans of the sick and the despairing whispers of parents attempting to comfort those they could not save. Stories passed among the captives, whispered in fleeting moments of solidarity, were the only thread connecting them to memory, to identity, to a past that seemed to recede further with each passing day as the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The crew above deck, focused on maintaining order and protecting the cargo that represented their livelihood, often had little empathy for those below. Punishments for unrest could be brutal. A slight resistance or a protest might provoke a whipping, a chain being tightened, or confinement in an even smaller, more suffocating space. Yet even in the midst of such oppression, the enslaved found ways to assert their humanity, to remind themselves and others that they were more than the property imposed upon them. They sang, whispered prayers, and occasionally staged acts of defiance, small sparks of resistance that defied the claustrophobic, violent world around them. The movement of the ship itself seemed to conspire against them. Storms tossed the vessel across the waves, forcing the bodies below to shift in ways that caused further injury, pain, and fear, while the constant rocking made sleep nearly impossible, leaving captives in a perpetual state of exhaustion. Food, when distributed, was minimal, often consisting of grains or water so poor in quality that it did little to sustain the body, and the water for drinking was sometimes contaminated, spreading disease even further. Sanitation was non-existent. Human waste accumulated among the captives, attracting vermin and intensifying the stench that filled every inch of the hold, making the very act of breathing a trial of endurance. Yet, within this unimaginable suffering, the human spirit persisted. Some found ways to support one another, sharing scraps of food or comfort, speaking encouragement when voices were hoarse, holding hands in silence to remind each other that they were not entirely alone. Stories of home were recounted, of villages, rivers, and mountains left behind, small islands of memory that allowed the mind to escape, if only for brief moments, from the crushing reality of the journey. Children, despite exhaustion and fear, sometimes laughed or cried in ways that reminded adults of their own resilience. And parents whispered promises that they might yet survive, that they might see their homes again, though the truth of the ocean's cruelty was never far from their thoughts. The Middle Passage was designed to reduce people to mere cargo, to erase identity and humanity in service of commerce. Yet it never fully succeeded. The heat, the sickness, the chains, and the darkness could not completely extinguish memory, courage, and hope. Every heartbeat, every whisper, every act of quiet resistance became a testament to survival, a reminder that even in the most oppressive conditions, the human spirit could endure. These ships, so overcrowded and suffocating, carried not only suffering and death, but also resilience and the undying determination of millions whose lives, though violently uprooted, left an indelible mark on the world that awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic. Through this harrowing passage, the enslaved Africans faced unimaginable hardship, yet their experiences laid the foundation for a shared history, a story of endurance that transcends the confines of the ships, echoing across generations as a testament to both human cruelty and the extraordinary strength required to survive it. The Middle Passage was not merely a voyage across the Atlantic. It was a relentless crucible of suffering where the human cost was calculated as part of an economic equation, a grim reality that made every day aboard the ship a test of endurance and despair. For those confined below deck, the world was one of darkness and heat, of bodies pressed together so tightly that movement became almost impossible, and every breath carried the weight of exhaustion, fear, and disease. The air, thick with the stench of sweat, unwashed skin, and human waste, seemed to cling to the lungs, making even the simplest act of breathing a struggle. Illness spread quickly through this confined space, turning the overcrowded hold into a floating graveyard for those whose bodies could no longer withstand the conditions imposed upon them. Historians estimate that between 15 and 20% of the enslaved Africans did not survive the crossing, succumbing to dysentery, smallpox, scurvy, and a host of other ailments that found fertile ground in the suffocating, unsanitary hold of the ship. The loss of life was staggering. Yet for the captains and traders who profited from the transatlantic trade, these deaths were considered an expected and acceptable part of the voyage, a normal loss in the brutal arithmetic of commerce. Records of logs and ship manifests reveal bodies stacked and discarded, sometimes hastily thrown overboard, the waves swallowing them as if the ocean itself had been complicit in the cycle of death and displacement. Each life lost represented not just a statistic but a shattered existence, a mother separated forever from her child, a father removed from his family, communities ripped apart and culture fragmented. The cries and moans of the dying mingled with the silence of those who had lost all hope, creating an atmosphere so heavy with grief that it seemed to press down on the living, as though the ship itself mourned the unending human tragedy it carried. Yet, amid the horror, there were fleeting glimmers of humanity. Whispered prayers, soft lullabies, hands grasped for comfort, and the shared understanding that survival required not just endurance of the body, but resilience of the spirit. Captains and crew, motivated by profit, often maintained strict routines that prioritized control and efficiency over compassion. The enslaved were counted, inspected, and packed more tightly to ensure that as many as possible could be carried. With little regard for health or welfare, the ships were engineered to maximize space, often placing those already weakened by the arduous march from inland villages into even more confined quarters. Food and water, when provided, were meager and often of poor quality, insufficient to sustain life for weeks on end, while the crew focused on maintaining order and ensuring the cargo human lives treated as merchandise arrived in a condition that would still yield financial return. Even in the midst of such despair, the enslaved found ways to resist inertia. Some tried to communicate with one another across the dark, cramped spaces, sharing fragments of language, culture, and memory, attempting to preserve a sense of identity that the voyage sought to destroy. Acts of defiance, small and sometimes desperate, appeared in the form of refusing to eat, singing covertly, or quietly comforting one another in ways that sustained morale and reminded the captive that they were not merely cargo, but human beings with dignity intact despite the brutality surrounding them. These moments, though rare, were critical in keeping hope alive and reinforcing the understanding that even in the most inhumane conditions, human connection could not be entirely extinguished. As the voyage stretched on, the cumulative effect of disease, malnutrition, psychological trauma, and the relentless ocean created a landscape of death and suffering that was both tangible and invisible. Families, villages, and cultures were being dismantled in a slow, agonizing process, while the ship's logs often recorded these losses with a clinical detachment, noting names and numbers without acknowledging the depth of pain behind each life lost. For the enslaved, every passing day was a reminder of fragility, every wave a symbol of the immense forces against which they struggled, and every illness or injury a potential end to a life forcibly removed from its origin. The Middle Passage also exposed a chilling paradox. The very ocean that threatened to claim the lives of the enslaved carried them toward the Americas, where they would be forced to labor, build new societies, and yet remain under the yoke of oppression. Death, however, was not only physical. It was symbolic of the attempt to erase a people's history, culture, and identity. Yet despite the staggering mortality, stories of endurance persisted. Survivors carried with them memories, traditions, and knowledge that would endure across generations, ensuring that the Middle Passage, though intended to obliterate, instead became a foundation for the resilience and identity of the African diaspora. The staggering loss of life, 15 to 20% on any given voyage, was more than a statistic. It was a human catastrophe whose reverberations continue to be felt today. Each body lost to the ocean represented a world extinguished, a lineage interrupted, and a culture partially erased. Yet simultaneously, every survivor became a testament to endurance, a carrier of memory and identity across impossible odds. The Middle Passage, therefore, remains a story not only of suffering and death, but of courage, resistance, and the unbreakable determination of human beings to survive, even when confronted with conditions designed to destroy them entirely. The horrors of the Middle Passage extended far beyond the unbearable physical conditions aboard the ships, reaching deep into the very essence of human identity, tearing at the threads that connected individuals to their families, communities, and culture. When men, women, and children were captured from their villages and marched toward the waiting vessels, the first act of dehumanization began long before they set foot on the deck. Names were stripped away and replaced with numbers or European-assigned labels, severing the intimate connection between self and ancestry, and leaving people with a profound sense of dislocation before the journey even began. Language, once a tool of communication and a repository of culture, was suppressed, deliberately muted, and often forbidden as a way to prevent solidarity and to weaken the bonds of shared memory. Families were torn apart in the most calculated of ways. Parents were separated from children, husbands from wives, siblings from one another, sometimes sold to different traders or sent to entirely different ships, creating a landscape of despair where the familiar warmth of kinship became a distant memory. The cries of children seeking their mothers and the anguish of parents searching for their young echoed through the wooden holds of the ships, often unanswered and silenced. Swallowed by the relentless rhythm of the ocean and the indifference of those profiting from human suffering. In this environment, Survival demanded not only physical resilience but an extraordinary psychological endurance. For the enslaved were forced to reconcile themselves with a reality designed to strip away not just freedom, but identity itself. As the days and weeks passed, the enslaved developed subtle ways to preserve fragments of their culture, quietly defying the attempts to erase it. Whispers in native tongues, covert songs passed from one captive to another, and shared memories of homeland became lifelines. Ways of asserting that they remained human despite the chains that bound them. These acts of resistance, often invisible to the crew above, created networks of understanding and solidarity, allowing people to retain a sense of self in the midst of systematic attempts to erase it. Every gesture, every remembered word or melody, became an act of defiance against a system that sought to reduce them to mere cargo. The psychological toll of this erasure was immense. The forced suppression of personal and communal identity left many in a state of disorientation and grief that could last far beyond the voyage itself. People were haunted by the loss of their names, the inability to speak their languages, the impossibility of recognizing family members even if they survived the crossing. Memories of home became both refuge and torment, offering brief solace but also reminding them of what had been stolen. Elders, often the carriers of collective memory, tried to pass on knowledge, stories, and traditions in whispered exchanges, but the conditions of confinement made such transmissions difficult, leaving gaps in the continuity of culture that could never be fully restored. The process of stripping away identity was not incidental. It was deliberate and strategic, aimed at making resistance more difficult and the captives more controllable. By severing connections to community, heritage, and self, the enslaved were rendered vulnerable, psychologically isolated, and dependent on the structures imposed by their captors. Yet, even within this calculated oppression, the human spirit persisted, manifesting in small acts of remembrance and the quiet insistence that they were not merely property but people with histories, beliefs, and aspirations. Every story shared, every ritual quietly observed, was a refusal to surrender the essence of humanity, a thread of continuity that connected them to ancestors who had nurtured them, and to descendants who would one day inherit their resilience. The Middle Passage thus functioned not only as a physical journey across the ocean, but as an assault on the very fabric of human identity. The systematic erasure of names, languages, and familial bonds was a mechanism designed to weaken the enslaved, to make them more pliable, and to extinguish the cultural knowledge that had defined generations. Yet, the legacy of resistance persisted, carried in memory, in the survival of traditions, in stories passed down orally, and in the indomitable sense of self that refused to be fully extinguished by chains, disease, or despair. Even in the dark, suffocating hold of the ship, where hope seemed almost impossible to sustain, acts of cultural preservation and the insistence on maintaining humanity became lifelines, small but potent victories against the enormity of the forces arrayed against them. By the time these ships reached the Americas, the captives who survived had endured not only the physical torment of cramped, disease-ridden holds but also the profound psychological trauma of having their identities attacked at every turn. Their names, languages, family ties, and cultural knowledge had been assaulted, but through acts of subtle resistance, memory, and solidarity, they managed to retain fragments of who they were. These fragments would become the foundation for the rich, complex cultures that emerged among African diaspora communities in the New World, testaments to resilience and to the ability of humanity to endure even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. In the end, the Middle Passage was more than a journey of physical suffering. It was a crucible that tested the strength of human identity, challenging each individual to preserve who they were against impossible odds. The deliberate erasure of culture and self was intended to annihilate, yet the survival of memory, language, and familial bonds, however fragmented, stands as enduring proof that the human spirit, even under the harshest oppression, cannot be fully extinguished. Through the preservation of stories, songs, and traditions, the enslaved carried their identities forward, leaving a legacy that would inform generations and remind the world that even in the darkest conditions, humanity refuses to vanish. Even in the suffocating darkness below deck, where the air was thick with stench and bodies pressed so tightly together that movement was nearly impossible, the enslaved Africans refused to surrender entirely to the forces arrayed against them, and amid the overwhelming despair, sparks of resistance flickered like fragile lanterns in a storm. Life aboard these ships was designed to crush not only the body but the spirit, yet countless individuals found ways to assert their humanity, to reclaim fragments of agency in a world that sought to strip them of every right, every identity, and every hope. Some refused to eat, a desperate act that carried the dual weight of protest and survival, while others whispered prayers and sang in the languages of their homelands, maintaining invisible connections to the cultures the voyage tried so brutally to erase. The stories of revolt are both harrowing and inspiring, illustrating the lengths to which people would go to resist the dehumanizing conditions forced upon them. On some ships, the enslaved seized makeshift weapons or coordinated uprisings, fighting not just for freedom, but for the affirmation of their dignity in the face of unimaginable oppression. These acts were perilous, for any attempt at rebellion could provoke violent retaliation from the crew. Yet the courage required to defy captors under such conditions reflects the extraordinary resilience and indomitable will of those who refused to be reduced to property. The very act of resistance, whether through rebellion, refusal to comply, or the quiet preservation of language and memory, became a statement that they remained human, that their existence was not solely for the benefit of others, and that their lives carried meaning beyond the calculations of profit. One of the most famous instances of such defiance occurred aboard the Amistad in 1839, when a group of Africans being transported from Sierra Leone seized control of the ship. Against all odds, they navigated their path to freedom, demonstrating extraordinary courage, intelligence, and solidarity. The Amistad Uprising became a symbol not only of resistance but of the assertion of identity and dignity, a historical moment that reverberated far beyond the deck of the ship to challenge the very legal and moral foundations of slavery itself. Their story reminds us that even in the most constrained and brutal circumstances, the human spirit can refuse to bow, and acts of defiance, no matter how small or fleeting, carry immense significance. Hunger strikes were another form of resistance, quiet yet powerful. By refusing sustenance, the enslaved asserted control over their own bodies in a situation where every other aspect of their existence had been taken from them. Such acts were dangerous and often punished severely, yet they represented a deliberate and conscious refusal to submit entirely to a system designed to render them powerless. Similarly, suicide, though a tragic manifestation of despair, can also be interpreted as a final act of resistance, a refusal to live as a commodity, and a statement that autonomy could not be entirely stolen, even when survival demanded it. Beyond physical actions, resistance often took subtler, psychological forms. Families, though torn apart, found ways to communicate across decks or whisper songs that carried meaning across barriers of chains and darkness. Elders preserved stories of homelands, histories, and traditions, ensuring that culture survived even as the immediate circumstances threatened to erase it. These acts of cultural and spiritual resistance were equally vital, sustaining the collective memory and identity of communities under siege, and laying the groundwork for the resilience of African diaspora cultures in the Americas. Even in confinement, every song, story, and whispered word became a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to strip them of their humanity. The cruelty of the Middle Passage was designed to enforce submission, But the courage and ingenuity displayed by the enslaved reveal that defiance was never entirely extinguished. Revolts like the Amistad, acts of hunger, prayer, and the preservation of culture all testify to the refusal to accept oppression passively. Each act, whether large or small, carried profound significance, reinforcing the understanding that human dignity cannot be fully captured, chained, or silenced. Across the waves of the Atlantic, these acts of resistance echoed, shaping the consciousness of both those who survived and the generations that followed. Even when death was a constant companion, many found ways to resist with their spirits intact. The Middle Passage was intended to break them utterly, to erase memory, identity, and hope. But instead, it produced countless stories of courage, solidarity, and resilience. Each whispered prayer, every clandestine song, every daring act of rebellion was a declaration that life cannot be reduced solely to labor or profit, that even in the face of systemic dehumanization, people retain the capacity for agency, self-determination, and resistance. These stories challenge the narrative that the enslaved were passive victims. They reveal individuals and communities who fought for dignity and identity in every conceivable way, asserting their humanity in defiance of circumstances designed to deny it. The Middle Passage, therefore, is remembered not only for its suffering and brutality but for the extraordinary resilience, ingenuity, and courage of those who endured it. Acts of revolt, hunger strikes, and cultural preservation illuminate a truth that transcends time, that even in the darkest conditions, the human spirit finds ways to assert itself, to survive, and to resist, leaving a legacy of defiance and dignity that continues to inspire generations. The Middle Passage was more than a human tragedy. It was a powerful engine that fueled the wealth and expansion of European empires, a journey whose consequences reached far beyond the cramped, disease-ridden holds of slave ships and into the very heart of the emerging global economy. The labor extracted from enslaved Africans became the foundation upon which vast fortunes were built, the raw material that powered sugar plantations, tobacco fields, and cotton mills, and the profits generated flowed through ports in England, Portugal, the Netherlands, and France, transforming small maritime nations into imperial powers capable of reshaping the world. Each ship that crossed the Atlantic carried not only human lives but also the promise of profit. Its cargo traded, sold, and exploited to generate wealth that was celebrated in markets and courts, while the lives of the enslaved were reduced to numbers in ledgers, their suffering ignored, and their humanity denied. This economic boon, however, existed alongside a profound moral contradiction. Nations that spoke of liberty, enlightenment, and justice were complicit in a system that treated millions of human beings as property, buying and selling them as if they were commodities rather than fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. Merchants, politicians, and even clergy profited from this commerce, often rationalizing it through twisted interpretations of religion, law, or the supposed superiority of one people over another. The same ports that celebrated freedom and trade were also sites of immense suffering and oppression, where the contrast between ideals and actions could not have been starker. And yet the pursuit of wealth and global influence often overshadowed any consideration of morality. The infrastructure of empire grew around the machinery of slavery. Forts and warehouses along the African coast became nodes in a network of extraction, designed to gather and hold human beings with maximum efficiency, while European markets, shipping routes, and colonial plantations ensured that the profits generated from this system reached the hands of merchants and rulers far removed from the horrors of the ships themselves. Banks, insurers, and merchants calculated losses and gains as though the people themselves were cargo. Yet the profits were real, funding further exploration, investment, and colonization. In this way, the Middle Passage was both a tragedy and an instrument of power, creating economic growth that relied upon human suffering, and embedding the wealth of empires in a moral paradox that history has wrestled with ever since. Yet the story of wealth and commerce does not erase the experiences of those enslaved. Rather, it casts those experiences in a context that highlights both resilience and injustice. Every act of endurance, every whispered song, every rebellion or quiet resistance took place within a system designed to exploit, profit from, and erase people entirely. The juxtaposition is stark. The same ocean that carried suffering also enabled empire. The same ships that confined bodies and identities carried the seeds of global capitalism. These paradoxes reveal not only the cruelty of the system, but also the extraordinary persistence of human spirit. As enslaved Africans and their descendants retain knowledge, culture, and dignity even while being forced into unimaginable labor and oppression. The economic motivations of European nations were deeply intertwined with the development of industry and trade networks that shaped modern society. Yet they were built on a foundation that depended upon inequality, violence, and the suppression of freedom. From the fields of the Caribbean to the ports of Liverpool and Nantes, the products of enslaved labor enriched a small elite while millions of people were uprooted from their homes, enduring unimaginable suffering to generate the resources that would finance further expansion and political power. The consequences of this exploitation were global, influencing not only the growth of European empires but also the social, cultural, and political development of the Americas, where enslaved Africans and their descendants were forced to rebuild lives under conditions of oppression and dehumanization. Despite the wealth it generated, the system exposed contradictions that were increasingly difficult to ignore. Enlightenment thinkers debated the morality of slavery. Religious leaders questioned the ethics of profiting from bondage, and enslaved people themselves challenged the legitimacy of a world that sought to commodify them. Revolts, escapes, and legal battles punctuated the narrative, reminding the world that human beings could not be fully reduced to property, and that moral and ethical considerations would eventually confront economic interests in ways that reshaped nations and laws. The paradox of liberty and exploitation became a defining tension, one that would echo through abolitionist movements, revolutions, and the ongoing struggle for human rights across centuries. The legacy of the Middle Passage in this context is therefore dual. It is a record of unimaginable suffering and dehumanization, and simultaneously, a story of the forces of history, economics, and power that shaped the modern world. The immense profits it generated highlight the ways in which wealth was accumulated at the expense of lives and identities, while the acts of resistance, endurance, and survival by the enslaved illuminate the enduring capacity for human courage in the face of systemic oppression. Understanding the Middle Passage requires acknowledging both realities: the rise of empires and capitalism built on suffering, and the unyielding strength of people whose identities, cultures, and humanity refuse to be erased entirely. In the end, the Middle Passage serves as a stark reminder of the moral contradictions inherent in human history. It is a story in which immense wealth and power were achieved through acts of cruelty. Yet it is also a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the refusal of the human spirit to be completely subdued. The economic prosperity of European empires came at the cost of millions of lives, but the legacy of those who endured, who resisted, and who preserved their culture and dignity offers lessons that remain profoundly relevant, illuminating the costs of unchecked ambition, the consequences of dehumanization, and the enduring strength of human courage even amidst the darkest circumstances. The Middle Passage, though centuries in the past, is not merely a historical event. It is a wound whose echoes continue to shape the identity, culture, and collective memory of the African diaspora today. The trauma experienced by millions of men, women, and children during the transatlantic journey left indelible marks that extend far beyond the ships, the plantations, and the centuries of exploitation that followed. Families were torn apart, communities uprooted, and cultures disrupted. Yet from these horrors emerged a resilience that has informed generations, a spirit that refused to be fully silenced or erased. The descendants of those who survived carry this legacy in their blood, in their stories, and in the art, music, literature, and traditions that preserve the memory of both suffering and survival. Art has become one of the most profound ways in which the African diaspora remembers and interprets the Middle Passage. Paintings, sculptures, and installations across the world depict the cramped holds of the slave ships, the anguish of separation, and the courage of resistance. These works are not simply representations of pain. They are acts of remembrance, of reclamation, and of teaching. Through them, artists give voice to the countless individuals whose lives were stolen, and in doing so, they invite viewers to confront the human cost of history while reflecting on the endurance of those who survived. Music, too, serves as a vessel for memory and identity. With spirituals, blues, jazz, reggae, and hip-hop carrying threads of African heritage interwoven with stories of displacement, resilience, and hope. Songs that trace back to rhythms and chants of West and Central Africa remind communities that cultural identity cannot be entirely extinguished, even in the face of deliberate erasure. Memorials and museums around the world also ensure that the Middle Passage is not forgotten. Sites like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in the United States, the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, and the Gorée Island House of Slaves in Senegal stand as solemn reminders of lives lost, families broken, and the global consequences of slavery. Visitors walking through these spaces encounter the tangible weight of history plaques, chains, and preserved structures, all serving to educate and to honor the memory of those who endured unimaginable suffering. These memorials are more than historical exhibits. They are calls to reflection, empathy, and understanding, bridging the distance between past and present. The legacy of the Middle Passage also lives on in movements for justice and historical truth. Activists and scholars have long sought recognition of the wrongs committed, advocating for reparations, educational reforms, and greater awareness of the systemic inequalities that trace their roots to the transatlantic slave trade. These efforts remind us that the passage was not simply a chapter in distant history. It is an ongoing narrative whose consequences permeate contemporary society, influencing patterns of wealth, opportunity, and social mobility. By confronting these truths, communities reclaim agency over their history and assert the importance of memory as a tool for change, healing, and empowerment. Even in everyday life, the traces of the Middle Passage can be seen. Language, cuisine, religious practices, and storytelling among diaspora communities carry echoes of African origins, adapted and transformed through centuries of displacement and adaptation. These cultural continuities serve as living memorials, sustaining identities that the transatlantic journey attempted to erase. The resilience expressed in family traditions, communal bonds, and cultural celebrations demonstrates that, despite the trauma, heritage survived. Every act of cultural preservation is a statement of resistance, a refusal to allow history's horrors to define the totality of human experience. At the heart of these expressions is remembrance not merely of suffering, but of strength, creativity, and endurance. The Middle Passage was a deliberate attempt to obliterate identity and agency. Yet its survivors and their descendants forged communities, traditions, and narratives that continue to inspire and educate the world. From literature that recounts historical journeys to oral histories that capture the lived experiences of families across generations, the African diaspora has created a rich tapestry of memory, ensuring that the Middle Passage is neither forgotten nor reduced to statistics in a textbook. As we reflect on this history, it becomes clear that the Middle Passage is not simply about the past. It is a lens through which we can understand resilience, justice, and the human capacity for hope. Acknowledging the trauma, honoring the memories, and amplifying the voices of those affected allows the world to confront uncomfortable truths, while celebrating the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be fully silenced. The legacy is not only in what was lost but in what was preserved. Identity, culture, and the unyielding insistence on dignity, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of the Middle Passage, a story that is at once painful, inspiring, and essential to understanding our shared history. By remembering, reflecting, and sharing these stories, we honor the lives of those who endured, celebrate the resilience of their descendants, and ensure that the lessons of the past continue to inform the present and future. If you believe in the power of history to teach, to heal, and to inspire change, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others so that more people can learn, remember, and be moved by the enduring legacy of the Middle Passage. Together, we can keep these stories alive, shining a light on resilience, courage, and the profound strength of the human spirit.